Whispers in the Cotton Fields. Chapter 1. The Field That Heard Her Name. The cotton field stretched as far as the eye could see, a sea of white that glowed beneath the early morning sun. Dew clung to the leaves like tears refusing to fall. It was quiet, but not silent. The field whispered, softly, almost inaudibly, as though breathing the names of those who had once walked its rows. Among them was Clara. She was no older than 13, her frame slight, her back already bent from seasons of picking. But her spirit hadn't yet broken. She still hummed when the breeze passed through, not songs she'd learned from anyone alive, but melodies she swore the earth taught her, tunes the field itself passed along from roots buried deep in sorrow and survival. That morning, as she reached for another bowl, her hand froze. The wind shifted, and in the space between rustling stalks, she heard it. Her name, Clara. Barely a whisper, but clear, familiar. She looked up, heart pounding. No one was near. Just the swaying of the cotton and the low groan of the trees at the edge of the field. She backed away, stumbling slightly, her sack of cotton trailing behind her. Again the voice came. Clara. This time it carried a memory. Her grandmother's voice. The one who'd been taken when Clara was just a baby. The woman no one spoke of, because her truth was too heavy for daylight. Clara stood still, closed her eyes and listened. The whispers came in waves now. Stories, names, warnings, lullabies. Each one seemed to rise from the soil, passed through by the roots of the cotton plants that had grown fat of suffering. In that moment, Clara realized the field wasn't just a place of labor. It was a grave, a memory, and now, somehow, it had chosen to speak to her. She didn't know why, only that she couldn't pretend she hadn't heard it. She reached down, touched the ground, and whispered back, "I'm listening." Chapter 2. A Song Buried in Dusk. The song came at dusk. Not sung but felt, carried on the wind like ash from a fire long dead. Clara sat on the edge of the porch, her bare feet dusty from a day's labor, her hands still aching. Her aunt was inside, humming a hymn too cracked to be holy, but what Clara heard wasn't that. It was older, sadder, and somehow the sound drifted from the fields, low and weighty, like the breath of something buried too long beneath silence. She leaned forward, eyes scanning the distance. The fields shimmered under the last orange light of the sun, and for a moment she imagined the cotton plants swaying in rhythm, not to the breeze, but to memory. That evening, as the family gathered for supper, Clara couldn't eat. The taste of the song still coated her tongue like dust. Her uncle spoke about yields and weather. Her aunt warned of snakes in the east rows, but Clara heard none of it. Her ears were full of something else, something deep and aching. Later, in bed, she tried to hum it. The melody wasn't clear, like it didn't want to be known, only remembered. But as her voice followed its path, the room around her seemed to shift. The walls faded, the creaking floorboards fell silent, and there she was again, her grandmother. Younger, dancing barefoot under moonlight, singing to the rhythm of her own heartbeat, a tune only the dead and the brave still knew. Clara wept softly, not from fear, but from knowing. The song had been waiting. It had chosen her, and if she didn't carry it forward, it would vanish again beneath the weight of dust and forgetting. So, she sang, not for the living, but for those who could no longer sing for themselves. Chapter 3. The Shack with No Shadow. The shack stood at the farthest edge of the plantation, where the cotton gave way to woods too thick for light to pass through. It was smaller than the rest, leaning, half swallowed by vines, and yet Clara had always noticed it. Unlike the other cabins, it cast no shadow. No matter how bright the sun, no matter how long the day. She first saw it in full during a delivery run, sent with a basket of biscuits wrapped in cloth. Her aunt warned her not to linger, to leave the food at the step and walk back quick, but curiosity crept in like a draft, and Clara paused. The shack looked like it had been forgotten on purpose. Its windows were boarded, the door swollen and split, and a faded symbol was scratched into the wood. Something circular, something strange. Clara placed the basket on the step and knocked once. No reply. She should have walked away. But something inside moved. A shifting, a breath. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorframe just to steady herself, and that's when she saw it. The carving below the symbol, just 3 letters, M-A-E. Her grandmother's name. The same one whispered in the field, the same one she'd seen in a dream. Clara backed away, eyes wide. The wind picked up, rustling the vines like they were trying to speak. She didn't enter, but she would return, because something was inside that shack. A truth, perhaps, or a memory buried so deep even the light couldn't touch it. And if she was going to understand the voices, the song, the whispers, she had to find out why May's name had been carved into a place that didn't cast shadows. Chapter 4. When the wind turned against us. The wind was no stranger to Clara. It had always been her companion, brushing through cotton fields like a messenger, sometimes soft and kind, sometimes loud and insistent. But on that day, it changed. It wasn't just that the wind was stronger. It was bitter, rushed, and angry. Clara had risen early that morning, determined to return to the shack with no shadow. The image of her grandmother's name carved into the wood haunted her, pressing against her chest like a secret too heavy to carry. She didn't tell her aunt or uncle. She told no one. She just walked. But as she stepped into the field, the wind shoved her. It pushed her back. The cotton bent hard against her path, as though the entire crop was turning away. She tried. Then came the sound. Not a voice this time. A howling. Deep, sorrowful, rising from the edge of the trees like something torn loose from another world. It wasn't animal. It wasn't human. But it was grief made sound. Clara stopped. The wind lifted her braid and threw dust into her eyes. And then she heard the words, not shouted, not spoken, but breathed into her ear. "Don't go today." She turned around so fast she tripped, falling hard onto the dirt. Her palms scraped open. Tears filled her eyes, not from pain, but from the force of whatever had just touched her. She crawled backward, away from the direction of the shack. The wind didn't follow her. It let her go. When she returned to the porch, her aunt stared at her scratched palms but said nothing. just poured water into a bowl and handed her a cloth. They sat in silence. The wind had calmed, but Clara knew what it had done. It had warned her. Whatever waited in that shack was not ready to be seen. Not yet. Chapter 5. The Girl Who Danced Alone. The clearing behind the barn wasn't much. A patch of dry earth surrounded by trees too stubborn to grow straight. But for Clara, it was sacred. It was where she'd first seen the girl. No one knew her name. Not anymore. The elders said she'd been gone since before the war. Just a story, they muttered. A warning. But Clara had seen her. It was late, nearly midnight, when Clara couldn't sleep. The house was heavy with heat and the weight of unspoken things. She slipped out barefoot, following the rhythm of something her body felt before her mind understood. There, under the crooked moon, the girl danced. She wore a dress, faded grey with time, hem frayed and floating. Her feet barely touched the ground, as if the earth itself refused to hold her. Arms outstretched, she spun in slow, perfect circles, silent, sorrowful, and strange. Clara didn't move, didn't breathe. The girl paused, and for a moment she turned. Her face was soft but hollow, like it had once held laughter and now only held memory. She raised her hand, not in greeting, but in beckoning. Clara stepped forward. A single step, and then the girl vanished. The air around Clara thickened. She fell to her knees, heart racing. In the dirt where the girl had stood, a circle of crushed lavender bloomed where none had grown before. The next morning, Clara returned. The lavender was gone. No footprints, no dress, but the space felt changed. Lighter, maybe, or more known. She didn't tell anyone, not even her aunt, but each night after that, Clara would return, just in case. And sometimes, just sometimes, when the wind caught her skirt just right, she danced too. Chapter 6. Secrets Sewn into the Hem. It was sewing day, and Clara dreaded it. Not because her fingers would be sore, or because her stitches would never match her aunt's, but because every time she touched the old fabric, something stirred inside her. Her aunt laid the dress across the table, long, faded, worn thin in places where time had done more than weather. "This was your grandmother May's," she said. "We mend it to remember." Clara nodded, though her hands shook. Each thread felt like it carried a story, and when her needle pierced the hem, it was as if she'd cracked open something sacred. Words rose in her mind, words she didn't know, but somehow understood. A mix of song and story, resistance and hope. Her stitches began to follow a rhythm that wasn't her own. Her aunt hummed softly as they worked. The tune was one Clara had never heard before, half lullaby, half lament, and as Clara listened, she realized it wasn't meant for joy. It was a song of survival. Inside the seam, she found something strange, a folded scrap of fabric, stitched tightly into the lining, hidden. Clara gently pulled at the threads and revealed a tiny piece of cloth, stained and faded, with a single name written in old ink. Ella. She looked at her aunt. Who was Ella? Her aunt went quiet. Then she sat. She was your great aunt. They took her before May could teach her to sing. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. Why would May hide her name in the hem? her aunt whispered, because names were erased. And sewing was how we held on. The room fell silent. Clara held the tiny piece of cloth in her hand, running her thumb over the faded ink again and again. She thought about how many names had been lost. That night, Clara didn't sleep. She sat with the dress in her lap and touched the hem over and over, whispering the name Ella like a prayer, as if by saying it enough, she could undo the silence time had wrapped around her family. But she didn't stop there. She found other scraps, smaller, harder to read, stitched into other dresses, hidden in bonnets, tucked into quilts. Some with names, some with dates, one with just the word free. She started collecting them, writing each name into a notebook. She began sewing again, not to mend, but to remember. She stitched her grandmother's name into the lining of a shawl, her mother's into the sleeve of a blouse. Her own name went into the hem of a skirt she wore on Sundays. When she showed her aunt, the woman only nodded and handed her more cloth. She would be proud, her aunt said. You're turning thread into testimony. So Clara kept sewing, because every stitch was a memory saved, every hem a heartbeat. So one day, someone would remember her too. So no one would ever be forgotten again. Chapter 7. The Overseer's Mirror. The overseer's house sat on the hill, high enough to watch the entire field like a god looking down on creation. It was the only structure painted white, its windows always shut, its porch always swept clean. But what Clara feared most wasn't the man inside. It was the mirror. They said he'd brought it from the city, framed in gold and taller than a man. They said it could see more than a reflection, that it remembered, that it showed things people tried to forget. Clara had never seen it until the day she was sent to deliver a letter. Her aunt's hands shook as she sealed the envelope. You take this. Be quick. Don't look where you're not meant to. Clara nodded, but her curiosity burned like a fever. Inside, the house was too quiet. She could hear her own breath bouncing off the walls. She walked past the parlor, past the grandfather clock that hadn't chimed in years, until she saw it, standing tall in the hallway. The mirror. She told herself not to look. But mirrors pull. She stepped closer, and in the glass she saw herself, but not as she was. She was older, worn, her hair wrapped in cloth, her eyes sunken with grief. Behind her, shadows moved, figures in chains, heads bowed, lips sewn shut. Clara stumbled back, nearly dropping the letter. The overseer appeared in the doorway. You shouldn't be in here. She thrust the letter forward, not meeting his gaze. He took it without a word, and as she turned to leave, the mirror flickered. Just once. Her grandmother's face, smiling. That night, Clara dreamed of glass shattering, not from force, but from truth. And in the shards, she saw every name that had ever been silenced, waiting to be spoken again. Chapter 8. Beneath the porch boards. The porch creaked with every step, the wood so old it groaned like it remembered too much. Clara had always felt uneasy there. Even as a child, she avoided sitting on the steps unless her aunt insisted. But that morning, something called her to it. It had rained the night before, and the earth beneath the house smelled rich, almost sweet. Clara crouched down, brushing away wet leaves and bits of cotton fluff that had stuck to the boards. One plank, second from the end, was looser than the rest. She pressed down, it shifted. Her heart pounded. Slowly, carefully, she pried it up. Beneath it was a cavity, not large, but deep enough to hide something. Inside was a tin box, rusted around the edges and tied with a strip of blue cloth. Clara lifted it out with trembling hands and sat cross-legged on the porch. Her fingers hesitated at the lid. She didn't know what she was about to uncover, only that it had waited long enough. Inside, she found letters, dozens of them, folded tight, their edges yellow with time. Some were addressed to May, others to no one at all. There were drawings of trees, of women, of a bird in a cage, and there were words. Poems, laments, warnings. I am not the dust they buried me in. My silence was survival, not surrender. We sang even when they tried to still our throats. Clara read until the sun touched the edge of the sky, and then she folded the letters back into the box, wrapped it in the cloth, and returned it to its place. But she didn't nail the board shut. She left it loose, so that someone else, one day, might hear the creak beneath their feet, follow the call of memory, and find the voices that had once lived, breathed, fought, and whispered beneath the porch boards. Chapter 9. A prayer the trees remembered. There was a corner of the woods where the trees grew taller than anywhere else on the land. Thick-trunked and heavy-limbed, they reached toward the sky like ancient hands, cracked and weathered with memory. No one went there after sundown, not even the elders. But Clara was drawn to it. She'd been dreaming of the trees for days, branches bending like they were bowing, leaves whispering words she couldn't yet make out. Her feet moved before her mind could catch up, and one late afternoon she found herself at the edge of the forest, watching the shadows stretch. She stepped inside. The air changed. It wasn't colder, but it was still, as if the trees were holding their breath. She walked slowly, tracing the path made by roots that jutted like veins from the earth. The deeper she went, the quieter it became, until even her breath seemed too loud. She walked until she came to a clearing, a place where the trunks circled a flat patch of earth. In the center stood a stump, worn smooth, almost like a seat. She sat, and the forest spoke, not in voice, not in language, but in feeling. Images flooded her mind. Women standing in silence, their hands linked in prayer. A man holding a baby to his chest as the woods filled with firelight. A young girl laying her palms against a tree, eyes closed in reverence. A boy digging into the soil with bare hands, burying something wrapped in cloth. A mother humming as she weaved strands of her own hair into the branches above her. This was not just a forest, it was a sanctuary, a church with no roof, a place where the enslaved came to pray, to mourn, to hope, when the world above ground offered none. And the trees had remembered every word, every name. Clara knelt, not because she had to, but because something inside her said this was the only place her prayer would be heard. She whispered her grandmother's name, then her great-aunt's, then her own. She whispered for Isaiah, for Ella, for the girl who danced. And then she did something she hadn't expected. She sang. Soft at first, a hum, more breath than melody. But it grew, curling into the limbs above her, wrapping around the trunks like silk. The wind didn't blow, the birds didn't sing, but the trees listened. And Clara felt, for the first time, not alone. She felt held. Chapter 10. The whip that cracked without sound. It was not the sound that haunted Clara. It was the silence. There was a story passed around in whispers, mostly by older women when they thought the children weren't listening, about a man named Isaiah who had once tried to run. He hadn't made it far, but the whip they used on him, it never made a sound. Clara had asked her aunt once, quietly, nervously, how could it not make a sound? Her aunt hadn't answered, just closed her eyes and hummed an old tune, low and broken. Now, standing by the old cedar tree where it had happened, Clara swore she could hear the silence itself pressing in. The air was heavy. The leaves did not rustle. No bird dared sing. She reached out and touched the bark. It was smoother than it should have been, as if the tree had tried to grow over the pain, but never quite could. Suddenly, her hand tingled, images flickered behind her eyes. A man's back, raised welts, a hand gripping a whip, and a crowd watching, not with horror, but indifference. Clara staggered back. The wind didn't blow, but the field behind her moved, as if responding to memory. She fell to her knees and wept, not for Isaiah alone, but for the silence that came after, for the children who never heard his name, for the tree that remembered when no one else had. She took a piece of charcoal from her pocket, kept from drawing, from remembering. She wrote his name at the base of the tree. Isaiah. The wind stirred, and somewhere deep in the silence, Clara heard something break. Not a scream, but a change. Chapter 11. When Cotton Cried Blood. The morning sky was bruised purple, the kind of color Clara had come to recognize as warning. The field looked the same, rows of white bobbing in the breeze, but the air held a tension, like the land itself was holding its breath. That day they were ordered to pick early. No breakfast, no water, just hands to the cotton, eyes to the dirt. Clara's fingers burned as she worked, the burrs biting into her skin, each pull leaving behind small scratches she was too tired to notice. Then came the scream. Not a long one, not even loud, but sharp, cutting through the silence like a blade. It came from the center row. Clara dropped her sack and ran toward it. A boy, maybe 8 or 9, sat on the ground, his hands crimson. Blood pooled in his lap. His sack had torn, spilling cotton everywhere, now soaked in red. He'd sliced his palm open on a rusted metal trap hidden between the stalks. Clara knelt beside him. "It's okay," she whispered. "Hold still." But it wasn't okay. The overseer saw the spilled cotton first, then the blood, and instead of help, he brought punishment. He shouted. The boy trembled. Clara stood up to shield him. "It's just a child." The man raised his hand, and that's when the sky opened. A sudden wind swept through the field. The cotton swayed violently. Dust flew up, blinding them all. The whip never landed. The man stumbled back. The boy clutched Clara, eyes wide in terror. They ran. Clara didn't stop until they reached the tree line. They waited there, panting, watching as the dust slowly settled. Back in the field, the cottons seemed to lean together, not in fear but in protest, as if even it had had enough. That night, Clara cleaned the boy's wound and stitched a bandage from an old cloth. She kissed his forehead and whispered, "Today," the cotton cried, "not just for you, for all of us." Chapter 12. Her voice in the hollow. The hollow wasn't on any map. It was the kind of place only passed down in whispers, spoken of after dark, when the grown folks thought no one else was listening. Clara had heard it mentioned once, just once, by her aunt, in a voice too low to be casual and too heavy to be safe. You go down past the willow, split in three, and you listen. If it calls your name, you leave. If it stays quiet, you may stay. Clara hadn't meant to find it, but her feet carried her past the willow, now split in three just as the tale described, and into a clearing carved like a bowl into the land. It was silent, not like the silence of the woods or the stillness of sleep, but something deeper, heavier, as if the air itself had forgotten how to carry sound. Clara stood at the center of it, closed her eyes. "Nay," she whispered. "Nothing. Nothing." Then her own name. Clara. The ground below her trembled, not with fear, but recognition, and from deep within the hollow, a voice rose. It wasn't a scream, or a song, or a cry. It was a name, hers, spoken not by one voice, but by many, layered like echoes passed down through time, each syllable soaked in memory. Clara dropped to her knees, tears falling fast. She heard the pain, the joy, the fire, the ash. They were speaking through her now. Stories untold, songs unsung, graves unmarked. And Clara, in the hollow no one dared name, found what she didn't know she'd been searching for all along. Not just the past, but her place within it. Chapter 13. A letter never read. The letter was hidden in the lining of her aunt's old shawl, sewn tight with black thread, as if the truth itself needed to be disguised. Clara found it by accident, her fingers catching on a loose stitch while folding laundry. She tugged the thread, and the edge of the paper appeared, crisp despite the years, folded with a kind of reverence that made Clara's heart still. She looked up. Her aunt sat nearby, back to her, staring into the fire. Clara said nothing. She took the letter to the porch, where the breeze might soften what she feared it would say. The handwriting was delicate but deliberate. To my daughter May, should the world ever allow you peace. It was from her great-grandmother, a woman long lost to time and silence. Clara read slowly, each word heavy with sorrow and strength. The letter spoke of stolen names and stolen sons, of secret births and hidden graves, of a love never spoken aloud and a song forbidden on white men's land. It wasn't just a letter, it was a confession, a legacy. It ended with a single line: "If you ever bear a daughter, teach her that silence is not safety, and if she must carry pain, let her carry it aloud." Clara held the paper to her chest, as if she could absorb its truth into her bones. Then she walked back inside. She handed it to her aunt. The woman didn't speak. She didn't cry. She only held it close and nodded. "It was never meant to be hidden," she whispered. "Just too dangerous to share." Clara looked into her aunt's eyes and saw generations staring back. "I'll read it," she said, "and I'll remember it." But remembering wasn't enough. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. The words ran through her mind like echoes. She sat by candlelight and copied them word for word into her own notebook. Then she added her own lines beneath it. "I am your daughter's daughter. I speak so you don't have to. I carry the sound of your truth." The next morning, she stood by the well where the others gathered. She cleared her throat, heart pounding, and began to read. One line, then two. At first, they didn't look at her, but then the words started to land, softly, like seeds. Her aunt stood beside her, said nothing, but she reached out and held Clara's hand. By the end of the reading, no one clapped, no one cheered, but the silence had changed. It was no longer heavy. It was full of memory, full of voices ready to be heard, because some letters were never meant to be sealed, only passed on, and read, and spoken, and remembered. Chapter 14. The fire they called cleansing. It began with smoke, thin and curling, rising like a ghost from the far end of the fields. Clara noticed it before anyone else. The adults were too busy with their burdens, the children too lost in weariness, but Clara saw it, and she knew. Fire doesn't ask for permission. It devours. By the time the alarm spread through the quarters, it was too late. Flames had caught in the dry cotton, greedy and fast. The overseers scrambled, shouting orders no one could hear over the crackle. Clara grabbed a bucket and ran toward the well, but her aunt caught her arm. "No," she said firmly. "There's something you need to save." Together they rushed to the porch, to the plank that hid the letters. The tin box was hot to the touch, but intact. Clara hugged it to her chest as the fire roared closer. The shack with no shadow went first. Clara watched the flames lick at its edges, and for a moment she thought she saw a figure in the doorway, still watching. Then it was gone. They gathered at the wood's edge, breathless, soot-smudged, hearts pounding. The overseers spoke of accidents, of cleansing, of the land starting fresh. But Clara knew better. This wasn't cleansing. It was erasure, a last attempt to burn away what refused to be silenced. The letters, the names, the prayers. Clara opened the box and began to read aloud. Even as ashes fell like snow, even as eyes turned toward her in disbelief, she read. Hello, Isaiah. The girl who danced. The child who bled. Each name a flame of its own, each word a refusal to be lost. The fire took the cotton, but not the truth, because Clara carried it now, and fire can only consume what's left behind. Not what lives in memory, not what's spoken aloud. Chapter 15. The last field she touched. The field had changed, not in the way the seasons change. Though the cotton was thinner, the soil more tired. It had changed because Clara had changed. She walked the rows with bare feet, the early morning dew clinging to her skin like a goodbye. Around her, the land was quiet, not silent, but waiting, listening. A soft hush, like breath before song. This was the field where she had first heard her name, where whispers clung to the wind and the earth exhaled memory. She bent down, fingers brushing over a cotton ball, not to pick, but to feel. The softness reminded her of hands that once cradled stories, hands that sewed names into seams, that left letters behind in rusted boxes, that danced beneath crooked moons. She closed her eyes and whispered their names, one by one. Isaiah, the boy whose blood-stained cotton, the girl who danced alone. She added her own name last. Clara. A hush followed. Then, as if the field sighed in return, a breeze rolled through the rows, gentle, knowing, full of remembrance. Behind her, the house stood empty. The fire hadn't taken everything, but enough. Her aunt had moved north. Others had scattered. The overseer's house sat quiet, the mirror long gone. But Clara remained. Not forever. Just long enough to press her palm into the dirt and say thank you. For the lessons, for the stories, for the ghosts. She placed the tin box back beneath the porch. The letters, the songs, the truths, wrapped tight in blue cloth, sealed not by nails, but by memory. Then she walked away, not with sorrow, but with purpose, because some fields are graves, some are altars, and some, like this one, are where voices rise, and where new roots begin.